anybody has a question, they can enter it into the chat box, and if you can alert us, Kathy and myself, as to the chat itself, because sometimes I may not see it.
Sure. Yeah.
So we're all kind of helping one another. And Jennifer is there, I think. Yeah, she's there.
She's muted.
And yeah, her video is off, so that's okay too. All right, so we're going to start in another minute or so, just to make sure that everything's good here. Okay. All right, is everybody all set?
All set.
Okay, good. All right, Nicole, we might as well get this going. All right. Okay, you are recorded. Hi, welcome to Project Help Long Island's Zoom discussion tonight. I'm Jeff Stone. I'm president of Project Help Long Island. With me is Kathy Levinson, vice president of Project Help Long Island, and a new member, Pat Lample. Hello, Pat.
Welcome,
thank you
Pat.
very much for joining. We will discuss affluence, alienation, and addiction, social disconnection, and the suburban drug crisis. All right. We'll explore how the social disconnection and lack of attachment to community can fuel household disorder, damage community efficacy, and make things like addiction, especially in our young people, more likely. Presenting the PowerPoint slides is Anthony Zankas, licensed master social worker, adjunct professor at Adelphi University. Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds, president and CEO of Family and Children's Association, FCA. David Sills, president of NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness, Queens, Nassau. And Ellen Ritz, RN, president emeritus, NAMI. And welcome to the show. With us, we have Connie Bruno, Jennifer DeSena of Manhasset CASA attending as well. Thank you. We like to bring in any coalition members possible, and also Renee Fischer is here, and ADA Nassau County, I guess, director of Heroin Task Force, if I got that right, Renee?
That's good enough.
Okay. So we will now open it up with Anthony Zankas. And by the way, this is being recorded. And if you need to ask a question at any time, put your question into the chat box and we'll pick it up and we'll ask the appropriate person for this, or if it's open for anybody who likes to answer that, we can do that as well. All right. So we'll have the link up on our Facebook page, Project Help Long Island, afterwards. And so there we go. Okay. Mr. Anthony Zankas, you've got the floor.
All right, Jeff, thank you. And thanks everybody for being here. I'm gonna share my screen. Give me 1 second.
Okay, in that 1 second, let me just bring up something that's very important. Is that I would like to thank very much the Peter and Jerry DeJana Family Foundation for their generous donation, and as well as the support of the Manhasset Port Washington Kiwanis Club. All right, there we go.
Okay. I think those houses are Levittown, somewhere in the 1950s.
Oh, we lived in Levittown, GI Bill.
Yeah, there you go. So, I just kind of jump into it. The things that that drew me to this discussion and why I'm really so interested in it is, I think about addiction. So a lot of people ask questions why some people can drink alcohol regularly and not have a problem, and other people become alcoholic. Why can some people use other types of drugs? Maybe they use marijuana occasionally, and then other people have an addiction. So where does really addiction come from? And these are the questions that a lot of people ask, and it's what drew me to this information. And so I'm hoping to give a little bit, shed a little bit of light on where addiction might come from. And the other piece, and also to look at, is why is it happening here to the extent that it is, especially with our opioid crisis? I mean, Long Island is a nice place. Here's where I grew up, Northport, New York. Renee Fisher from the DA's office of Nassau is also from Northport. And, you know, listen, it's an idyllic little town. It's a really great place to grow up. But if you have been on Long Island for a few decades, you might recall in the 1980s, there was a famous murder that happened in Northport. This young man on the left was 17 years old. His name was Gary Lowers, when he was brutally murdered by his childhood friend. They knew each other since first or second grade. This young man, Ricky Casso. Now, people who knew Ricky didn't recognize him in this photo because that's not what he looked like most of his life, even most of his teen years. One of the things that happened with this was this entire event became sensationalized. There actually was a press release which was sent out from the police department or the town, and it got a couple of things wrong, and the press ran with it. And the next thing they said was, there's a devil cult in Northport. Ricky had, said that he was a Satanist. So they thought that there was this devil cult that killed a kid, and they were coming after your children, right? This is actually profiled in a book written by Jesse Pollack called The Acid King. It's a pretty phenomenal read if you're interested in finding out the real story of what happened. And just a little piece here, this is some of the headlines that came out. These are.
And I keep meeting people from Long Island. The first thing we talk about, if we're around the same age, is, so, remember Ricky Casso? Sure do.
A Long Island, New York couple said today that it was the devil, drugs, and rock and roll that led their son to ritual murder.
Satanism, Judas Priest, give me a break, right?
17-year-old Richard Casso was accused of murdering another 17-year-old, Gary Lowers, in what police called a sacrificial killing.
Nobody messes with the Acid King.
They claimed he was high on mescaline when he was arrested.
The wall between fantasy and reality is slowly going to start to fade, you know.
Police believe that members of a devil worship cult,
The Knights of the Black Circle,
took Lowers to a wooded area in Northport, New York.
They just dragged.
Okay. So those were the headlines. I remember when it happened, there were media from all over the world, from Japan, from the UK, descending on Northport because there was this belief that there was a satanic cult in Northport. The real story never actually got told. The real story, and actually in the book, The Acid King, it does go into it, is that there wasn't a devil cult. Ricky was a broken human. He was a victim of horrendous and ongoing physical and psychological abuse at the hands of his father. His father had kicked him out of the house when he was 13. Now, you can't legally do it, but it happened. Ricky would sleep on friends' couches. He would sleep in sheds behind his friends' houses. Sometimes he slept on the boats in Northport. Not his boat, just he would find his way out to the boats and sleep on those. But often he would find a place in the woods. He dragged an old mattress back there. There's one poignant scene in the book where a parent says they were neighbors whose backyard bordered the woods where Ricky was living when he was like 14 or 15. And one day Ricky's father had found him and started beating him within an inch of his life. And the neighbor said to his son, he could hear the wailing of Ricky screaming as his father was beating him. And he said, one day we're going to find that young man hanging from a tree. Well, he didn't die hanging from a tree. He died hanging in his jail cell a couple of days after being arrested. So again, everybody throws their hands up. What could it be? Could it be the heavy metal music? Is it the devil? And what it turns out is Ricky's experience from early teens had been destroyed by his family. And the other thing that I think is important to note was that he had the physical abuse, he had the psychological abuse, and it was ongoing and it was severe. There's also, there had been talk that he had been sexually abused by an older man that he used to do drugs with down in Northport. Well, Ricky had addiction, drugs were involved in the slaying, that was definitely true. But the other thing was that after Gary's body was put in a shallow grave in Northport, at least a dozen kids, and some people think as many as 20 or more, were led up by Ricky and some friends to see Gary's body in the woods. And not one of them told. None of them called the police, and none of them told their parents. One kid had heard about it from another, and she actually told her father, who called the police. But those kids who saw the body, this was their friend since first, second grade, they didn't call. How could that be? So it wasn't just that Ricky was disconnected from his family. He was with a whole group of friends that were disconnected from their community. And again, Northport's like a lot of nice communities, Port Washington, Manhasset, all these pretty towns, but something else was going on. There was a study done in the late 1990s called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And what they tried to find out was, how could a baby with all this potential, right? That baby could be anything they want. They could become a law enforcement or officer or a teacher or an artist. They could do anything. Why and how does a child with all that potential turn into a young man who ends up losing his life to drugs and then taking the life of another young man? I mean, not only did we lose those two lives, the entire community was devastated. So back in the late 1990s, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study. And what they did was they looked at 17,000 adults, and they tried to determine if they had been exposed to any one of the following 10 potential categories of abuse or trauma. You know, they determined if this group was physically, psychologically, or sexually abused. Did these individuals suffer emotional or physical neglect? Or did they grow up with household dysfunction like addiction or domestic violence or mental illness? And for each thing you say, yes, that happened to me, you get a score of 1. That's your Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE score. What this really means is, if you were exposed, and they didn't ask you how many times these things happened, but if you were exposed to physical abuse and you were exposed to psychological abuse, and you had a father that was addicted to alcohol and pills, your ACE score would be 3, because you would say you had those 3 things happen to you. Out of this first study, a whole bunch of other studies grew, and what we found out was 1/3 of us have a score of 0. None of those things happened, but 2/3 of us have a score of at least 1. 26 or 27% of us have a score of 3 or more, and about 17% of us have a score of 4 or more. And the question then was, well, so what? Well, the so what is this: they have all their health records for these people, so they wanted to see if there was a connection between how much trauma somebody might have suffered in childhood and their health outcomes as adults. And it turned out it was very significant. The first thing they looked at was depression. Here is the connection between adverse experiences in childhood and chronic depression. If your ACE score to the left is 0, none of these things happen as far as you can remember. The women are in blue, the men are in green. You have a small percentage of people that suffer from chronic diagnosable depression. But if your ACE score is 3 or more, you've got double the risk for depression. If your ACE score is 4 or more, you've got nearly triple the risk for depression. And then they looked at things like addiction. But the first question was, well, then where does depression come from? If you weren't just born with it, is it possible that instead of a pathology, that we could also look at it as a normal response to abnormal life experiences, being thrown out of the home at the age of 13, being physically, emotionally, and potentially sexually abused? These things have cumulative effects. Turns out suicide is highly correlated with past trauma in childhood. The 1.4 on the top is, that's the percentage of people out of 100 that have an ACE score of 0, no trauma that they can think of, that actually attempt suicide. But what you look at is that it doubles if you have exposure to 1 adverse experience. It doubles again almost if you have exposure to 2. And with 4 or more, it's like 15, 16 times the risk of attempting suicide. Here's the connection with addiction. If you have an ACE score of 0, fewer than 5 in 100 people with an ACE score of 0 ever become addicted to alcohol or alcoholics in adulthood. But your risk doubles with exposure to just one category. It didn't matter which one it was. Could have been physical abuse. Could have been having a mentally ill parent. Your risk doubles again if you're exposed to two categories. If you were exposed to 4 or more, it's off the chart. So what we see is that this idea of addiction being something that's just pre-programmed in us, it's not that simple. Even things like injection drug use. And so we have an opioid crisis on Long Island and nationally. The likelihood that you would inject heroin if your ACE score was 0 or 1 is really, really tiny. But look what happens when your score is 4 or more. They found that adults with an ACE score of 6 or more, now that's a lot. That could be like physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, having an addicted parent, having a mentally ill parent, being abandoned when you were young, right? It's a lot. If your ACE score was 6 or higher, you had a 4,600% increase in the likelihood that you would inject heroin. That's a huge correlate. So what we really need to look at is that these things that we call depression, anxiety, addiction, often have their roots in trauma. This is the ACE study, and you can look at it. There's a nice website called ACEs Too High. They have a whole bunch of information, but it shows here in this pyramid that the more adversity, the more trauma you have in childhood, the more likely it is that you're going to develop risky behaviors and suffer from disease, disability, and serious social problems. When it comes to addiction, there's this myth that a drug that you do over and over just has these chemical hooks that latch onto your brain and cause addiction in and of themselves. And what we find to be true is actually you need more than just a potentially addictive substance or behavior, because it could be gambling. Gambling can be just as addictive as any substance. There are other things that need to be present. Having a high trauma score, having a lot of trauma, and the presence of stress in your life can make addiction far more likely. So I'm kind of asking you to think of addiction the way I'm asking you to think of depression, as a wound, as an injury from the environment, as an attempt to adapt to an unstable or fear-inducing or abusive environment. The part of the brain, interesting. So heroin is, by the way, one of the most effective pain relievers that we have. In fact, most hospitals in the United States, if you're, you've got some significant injury, you break your hip or in an accident, you will get heroin when you're in the hospital. But they don't call it heroin because it would scare people. They call it diamorphine. But diamorphine is heroin. It's the same substance. It's exactly what it is. And most people who receive that never get addicted to it, but some do. And why? That's the question we keep asking. Well, the reason they use diamorphine or heroin, because it is one of the most effective pain relievers we know. And it works on the pain center of the brain. And it turns out the physical pain center of the brain is the exact same center that lights up when we suffer emotional pain or emotional rejection. Basically, broken hearts and broken ankles light up the exact same part of the brain. So I think when we talk about our opioid crisis, instead of calling it opioid crisis, it might be more accurate to call it a pain crisis. But the pain that I'm talking about is not physical pain. It's emotional pain. And so we can see that emotional pain can come from a home where there's physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, or any type of dysfunction, especially when they happen more, when there's more than one thing happening. But the other type of abuse that can occur, or actually the other type of disconnection that can occur, is the disconnection outside of the home. Remember, the kids I'm talking about were disconnected from their community as well as their families. There's famous experiments done with rats. They took rats in cages and they gave them regular water with sugar in it, and they gave them sugar water with drugs in it, opioids or cocaine. And they found that most of the time the rats preferred the sugar water with the drugs in it. In fact, mostly they would use it over and over to the point of getting addicted, not eating, not sleeping, and then often they would overdose and die. Given the opportunity, there it was. So everybody said, well, chemical hooks. The availability of the drug, they did the drug, and they got addicted. These little rats, given the opportunity, like people, will do something over and over to the point of harming themselves. But there was a flaw in that experiment, and the flaw is this. Rats are social animals like people. And when you take a rat and put it in a cage all by itself with nothing to do and no other rats to play with, that rat becomes chronically stressed. So to do an experiment and check it out, a bunch of scientists and researchers got together and created Rat Park. It was a beautiful place. If you were a rat, the first thing is that you had other rats to play with. They even were able to make little rat families and have little rat babies, and they could play all day, and they had the sugar water with the drugs at the end of Rat Park. Many of them tried it once. Very few of them tried it more than once. None of them became addicted, and none of them died. There's an excellent TED Talk on this by a guy named Johann Hari, H-A-R-I. And he said, it's not the drug, it's your cage. And when people come from cages, their homes that are abusive and fear-inducing and threat-filled, or communities that are violent or have high levels of inequality or racism and that cause a lot of social disruption, they're not coming from cages that are very life-affirming. Another great book that I think if you're interested more in addiction is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by a guy named Dr. Mate. His name is spelled M-A-T-E with a little accent over it. Dr. Mate said that he met a heroin addict who was in her mid-20s, and she said, "Doctor, the first time that I injected heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug." We need to talk about that. What is the drug replacing, and what are people not getting in their communities? So there's social disconnection in the home. When there's social disconnection in the home, and social disconnection in the community, people don't get what they need to grow healthy and effectively. Love grows brains. And if we don't get it consistently, well, trauma can do a lot of damage, because trauma doesn't just cause wounds in our mind and our memories. It actually can physically change the brain. If you look at the brain on the right, that's a young child who was severely neglected and abused. It literally changed the way their brains function. And we know this. The good news is this. If it was just the genes, if they were just born this way and there was nothing we could do about it, well, so what? What can we do? But it's more than that. And I think it's an important thing to understand that it's actually good news, that it's the social environment that impacts us profoundly. And I don't like the phrase nature versus nurture. It really should be looked at as nature through nurture. Our biology matters a whole lot, but our social environment can literally change the way our genes are expressed and read. And if you come from a life-affirming place with an intact family, and you've got a healthy community that gives you opportunities, good education, learning, community involvement, the likelihood that you're going to destroy your life or someone else's life because of drugs is much, much lower. There's no such thing as a perfect world. But the question that really fascinates me is, what can we do to make Long Island more like Rat Park? And one of the things that I look at is the importance of social connection. How do we reconnect? Right now, we are living in an extremely disconnected society. This is before COVID hit. Go anywhere, go to a Starbucks, and there's everybody with their heads down in their phones. And I'm guilty of it. I got my little extra charger wherever I go. But the bottom line is, people are actually less socially connected now than they were before. That puts more stress on parents and families. Parents that are stressed are more likely to engage in abuse or neglect in the home, which means those ACE scores go way up. And another thing to think about is that chronic poverty actually raises the likelihood of a high ACE score. So it's not that those parents don't care about their children, they do, but the stresses are so significant and severe. Think about the people in Flint, Michigan, they haven't had clean water in 6 years. Those stresses are so severe, or people living in the heart of Chicago where there's shootings and killings on a daily basis. That stress is so severe that it makes it almost impossible to connect to your children in a healthy way. So I understand there's a whole bunch of factors that come into play when it comes to addiction, But the one we have the most control of is our communities and the way that we engage parents and families. How do we reconnect people? Because there was a bunch of kids that I grew up with. They were more like hippie kids from Northport. They weren't involved in all the negative stuff going on. They left Northport. They went and they lived on a farm in Tennessee for like a year and a half. Why would you leave such a beautiful town to do that? Because there they felt connection and they weren't getting it in their town. I don't have answers. I think answers cannot come from one individual and anybody with a degree that says, oh, IT. No, we've got to find our answers together. Understanding the influence of the environment, kind of like a bonsai tree. The bonsai is a miniature version of a big tree. And for the longest time, I'm like, where do you get bonsai seeds? And somebody said, hey, no, there are no bonsai seeds. It's the regular seed for the tree. The difference, and it's got the same exact genetic information as a big oak tree growing outside. But when you cut it down and restrict its environment, that bonsai tree doesn't grow to its fullest potential. So I'll leave you with a thought by a writer who writes for The New Yorker. His name is Louis Menand. And he said, the belief that it's only, I'm not saying genes don't have anything to do with it, they do, but the belief that it's all in the genes is an explanation for the way things are that doesn't threaten the way things are. Why should anyone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere. So when we look at our home, Long Island, the 10th most racially segregated region in the United States, with some of the biggest gaps between wealthy and poor people that exist anywhere in the country, we have to say, we can't solve all those big problems right away. But can we do something in our communities? Things like Project Help are a great start. I hope this information is helpful and I hope it frames our discussion. I'm excited to see where it goes. So thank you. If you want to email me with a question one day, there's my email address. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeff, you're muted. Can't hear you. There you go.
Thank you, Anthony, for a wonderful presentation. We could definitely look at this seriously for the way our communities are acting out right now. So if anybody would like to jump in and discuss this, please feel free at any time. Jeffrey, Ellen, David, it's all yours.
Yeah, so I will jump in. Thank you, Anthony. You did a great job of summarizing this in very, very clear and vivid terms. I've often thought about the impact of the suburban environment in which we don't really know each other. And if you think a little bit about the whole notion of social capital and kind of what we owe each other and what we do for each other and how that's declined over time, particularly in bedroom communities where people work in New York City and maybe just come here to sleep, which means that you don't get to know your neighbors in the same way. There's not the same level of mutual accountability or mutual aid. But there have been points along the way where that's all changed, right? So in my neighborhood, when my neighbors lost a bunch of trees due to the hurricane, everybody goes out there with a chainsaw and pitches in and works together. We saw that during Sandy. We saw that even very recently after the storm. I often wonder how we get that going and make that more of a permanent feature of our communities. And I think the way we handle COVID moving forward will answer some of those questions. The paradox of social isolation, of course, is that you get to see your neighbors even less. And we will insulate ourselves in a bubble as we flee a threatening and dangerous disease, yet we know that the largest killers, according to the CDC, are drug-related overdoses, alcohol-related fatalities, and suicides. And so when we look at substance use and mental health disorders, we know that there's a very, very direct connection between those things and how estranged somebody is feeling. I guess my hope in all of this is that as we continue to navigate COVID, there are more forums like this to talk a little bit about the mental health issues that are likely to creep up. But let's make no mistake about it. These were all pre-existing conditions that were around before COVID ever hit. COVID has laid them bare, and I think in some cases made some levels of stress and anxiety in some families even worse. We know that alcohol consumption has skyrocketed thanks to delivery apps and the fact that here in New York State, the only essential service for a couple of months was alcohol. You didn't used to be able to take alcohol from a restaurant and drink out in public. Now you can drive up in front and get a 55-gallon drum of margaritas loaded into the back of your car. All of that stuff has an impact, and that's all stuff that we need to navigate going forward. You know, we've also, and Anthony, you know this, we've also seen a spike in overdose fatalities here on Long Island because you are seeing more depression and anxiety. You're seeing some barriers to treatment that might not have existed before. And while virtual treatment in some ways is a good surrogate or replacement for face-to-face therapy, it's not for everybody all the time. It's a helpful tool, but believing that we can all just sit behind Zoom and experience the same thing that we might experience in a church basement or in front of a therapist is just not realistic. So, you know, I think this is a really challenging time. I think how we manage the mental health and substance use side of this as we move forward is just as important as we talk about a vaccine, as we talk about PPE, and as we talk about those other kinds of things. I wish, though, our elected officials were as upfront and strident and out there on this as a potential taker of life as they were around the threat associated with COVID. I don't see the balance, and in fact, right now, we're seeing a gutting of mental health services here in New York State with 20% cuts that have already been leveled, organizations beginning to close, programs stopping their operations. And so, you know, there's two things that I always recommend to folks that want to make a difference in this. One is that you reach out to another person and you don't just do it once or twice, that you do it often on a regular basis and you ask very specific and pointed questions, just not, how are you? And two, that we weigh in with our elected officials, that part of navigating COVID and the aftershocks has to be, what are the mental health symptoms and how have they been made worse by social isolation and some of the other dynamics that impact, you know, not only adults, but kids as well.
I could add also that not just with COVID, but prior to this, some of our institutions, like religious institutions, have been fading away, less people participating, and that was another area where you have community and social, and you support the aged, I mean, as well as families that are so important. I mean, you can use COVID as a time where you could actually be appreciative of spending more time with the family, of course. And of course, that could be also more problems depending on the family dynamics and what's going on there. So I know that as NAMI, and David and I are from National Alliance of Mental Illness, we also offer, which meant also I know Jeff does and many others, family programs to support families, but particularly parents who are struggling, or siblings or spouses who are struggling with someone with a mental health disorder, and trying to support them to figure out how to support, not control or fix, but how to support someone who's struggling. The connection is a basic human need. And I love that Anthony particularly stressed that with the rats as well, and how the social, you know, our social technology, our social media, it's good in some ways. In 1918, we didn't have this, so you completely were isolated during a pandemic. But on the other hand, it's also made anxiety increased, learning immediately, how when something happens, you would never hear from it from California or wherever, and suddenly everybody hears everything, and some of it is false news, but some of it is also very anxiety provoking, because the connection in that way is sometimes helpful and sometimes takes away a lot. So I loved your presentation, Anthony, and the panel who's here is very impressive, and I appreciate being part of it. So thank you. I'm Ellen Ritz, by the way.
David, anything to add?
I spoke to a SEPTA group last night. I was invited to speak to them. And because of a lack of communication, most of the members of the SEPTA did not know I was coming and didn't know what the topic was. And they sat with their mouths open because I started talking about some of the mental health problems that are coming out as a result of being together during COVID, worrying about babysitting if the parents had to go to work while the kids were doing classes on the computers last year and this year too, but everyone was doing it last year. And they started realizing it. Hey, you know, one woman said, I didn't realize it. My husband and I have been drinking more than we did in the past. My daughter is, another person said, my daughter, who used to be a happy-go-lucky girl, is now very cranky. And I never put two and two together and realized that there might be a connection between the emergency, you know, scaring the kids, you know, the kids are hearing horrendous things about what COVID could do. The adults are hearing the same things. Loss of social interactions, especially with the kids. They don't see their friends. They speak to their friends, but they don't see them. And some of the people at the meeting last night were really shocked. And they said, you know, thinking about it, things are going on in my house that I didn't realize were going on. And it was very sad. Very sad.
You know, there's a lot of literature that talks about uncertainty and the impact that has on individuals and how, you know, just we're hardwired to desire certainty just on an evolutionary kind of basis, that a little bit of certainty goes a long way in terms of ensuring your survival, and uncertainty tends to throw people off their game in a very significant way. And I think the uncertainty around COVID and what will happen on a large scale, but even when it comes to our young people, you know, my kids worry about, you know, I'm going to school today. Are we going to get a note home or a robocall tonight that's it, we're done until January again? And, you know, for folks that are used to structure and that find comfort in that structure and predictability, a lot of that has been taken away. And so one of the things that a lot of folks are recommending is find a way to try to introduce some structure back into your day. Over time, I think most people would say, you know, I've started having dinner earlier, maybe even drink earlier. You know, my day has been thrown into a spin, and finding a way to restore some order, both for adults and kids, in terms of what that schedule looks like, and getting up at a consistent time and working for blocks of time. That consistency and that certainty can help replace some of what's been lost. But I think, you know, more than anything, you have a bunch of things happening right now. You have the threat of physical disease, which, depending upon your age and your risk profile, can be very, very frightening. You have the uncertainty around schooling and what's happening in the world. You have a political and social environment that is very, very, very tumultuous. And so for even people who found some level of comfort and solace in connecting with friends on Facebook, guess what? That's all over until the election has passed. And then you have record unemployment rates here on Long Island, where you have 200 some odd thousand people who are out of work, who are worried about, you know, the changing plans around eviction and foreclosures and those kinds of things. And when you begin to bring that all together, you know, it's a well-worn metaphor, but you have the perfect storm. And it's a storm that I don't think that we're very well prepared to deal with. And that's beginning to show up in kids' mental health and in substance use disorders and that kind of thing in our community.
So some of the things that are helpful to look at is what can we control and what you can't control, right? And staying in the moment, mindfulness, trying to calm the anxieties and the chemicals in the brain, and increasing your immune system is really helpful, whatever that is. I know many people do yoga, meditation, but whatever that is for each of us is really important to take some time, if you can, every day. Because as you get into a stressful situation and you have that moment of calm, hopefully, that you can deal with the stress in a small, not in such a big way, and it maybe helps you change a situation or deal with, look at differently at a stressful situation. It really, and also really important to look at what we can't control. We can't control other people, but we can control how we keep safe and what we do. And also, I know that It's very hard with the stress and anxiety to acknowledge your feelings. To do that, it's really important. But also sometimes looking at what do we have, you know, something to be grateful for. And that also helps. It sounds really tough because some families and some situations are so complicated, but even if it's just the inner strength of getting up and saying, all right, I have a day ahead of me, what will happen? Maybe something good. So utilizing some of those tools is things that we can control, and, you know, and some of the things around us we can't, including the poverty, the jobs, and relationships.
Oh, if I could piggyback on what Ellen said, that was so important. Doing a short presentation like that, you can't get everything in. So one of the things I want to stress is I showed a PET scan of a brain of a child that had suffered from years of abuse and neglect. And it showed physical damage to that brain. Because trauma literally can affect us on a cellular level. And it'll leave an imprint on the brain and the rest of the body. But the good news is that experiences that are life-affirming and healing experiences can actually begin to repair that damage. So I want to just emphasize that Ellen mentioned mindfulness, meditation, and yoga. There's research out of the medical school at Harvard showing that things like mindfulness, meditation, and yoga done, and it's not just from Harvard, but it was a pretty impressive study, done on a regular basis can actually begin to heal the circuits in the brain that have been damaged by trauma. And also, whether or not you are a person suffering from mental illness, you know, especially anxiety, depression, or addiction, everybody is dealing with stress and anxiety during this pandemic. So one of the great things about mindfulness, meditation, and yoga, even just deep belly breathing, is that it can, in the short term, prevent anxiety from getting bad. So there are people who, like, you know, the heart rate doubles, the blood pressure goes up, it's a frightening thing. Doing the breathing on a regular basis can actually prevent those things from happening or make them less severe when they do happen. And that's something that anybody can use. There are a ton of apps on the web that you can download, most of them free, for your phone. And just learning about mindfulness and being able to take a break and do it is so important. When I do trainings for organizations that do addictions work or mental health work, I've been spending more and more time talking about body regulation and why we need to help people regulate the body, because we feel it there, right? It's not always a thought in our head. You could have a panic attack and someone could say, well, what's troubling you? But really, you might not be thinking of anything stressful. It might just be there's pain or there's tension in our bodies. So we have to really get into that mode of just looking at it more holistically. But again, the good news is this stuff is accessible. So thanks, Ellen, for bringing that up.
A couple of other, oh, Kathy, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, because you're on that stream, so go right
I'm
ahead.
just going to say is that a couple of the things that's really helpful is exercise. It doesn't mean you have to run around the block. It's just taking walks. You know, 30 minutes, I think 3 times a week is good. I mean, more is better. Getting sleep. Sleep is one of the most important things that increases your immune system. And if you can get 7-8 hours sleep, I know even with your anxiety, there are things you can do to get to sleep. So hopefully that will be helpful. I'm sorry, you see me wrestling. I have a brand new puppy. So I'm wrestling with the puppy, trying to keep it quiet.
Hey!
And that's what helps my.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, that's
Isn't she
great.
cute?
That's good
My
for
buddy.
stress.
So I'm trying to keep her quiet. So that's why I apologize for looking like I'm wrestling. So, but there are many things that are important within our well-being, our immune system, our keeping ourselves calm. All of those things have a real physiological influence. And
I just finished reading a book the other day. It's been a bestseller in the UK, and it's a book written by a psychiatrist who gardens. and it's called, where I have it right here, A Well-Gardened Mind. And she had done studies in prisons dealing with people with depression, and about, it's the well-gardened mind, and about getting outside, about nature, how helpful it is for depression, and for purpose. And it became this big bestseller in the UK, clearly this past year, past 6 months, with people
Can
gardening.
I just add something else that's wonderful? Because purpose, having a purpose, even as helping other people, being peer groups, support groups, whatever that is, that connection, that feeling that you have, a purpose, a meaning in your life is huge. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Renee, you have anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of, first of all, Anthony, it's always good to see you and always good to hear your topic of on the ACEs scales. Yeah, a couple of observations. It's totally coincidental, but I happen to be teaching right now a course on the psychosocial causes of crime and addiction. And I have 16, 19-year-old students who are adorable. They're up early in the morning to be confronted with me. And the good news is that they're engaged, they're trying, and every one of them has a job. I was stunned to know that they were doing that. And so that gives that purpose. The other good news is this whole technology that we're using, I consider us now the baby Zoomer generation, and we're enjoying it. So there's a little bit of hope here because I've noticed that all of us are doing more and more of this. We like seeing each other, we like discussing. How many of you have been able to stop a Zoom group? It's like a locomotive. Once people get good at it, they'd much rather do that than read a newsletter or a book.
Right.
And we're enriching each other. So I take that as a positive right now. But there's also another piece, and I know that Anthony and I both come from Northport, and Jeffrey and I both come from another semi-affluent community known as Douglaston, Queens. And I gotta say that when I was a defense attorney first starting out, the Rockefeller drug laws were just put into place, which we often talk about now as the debunked war on drugs. My clients, my kids, were not poor. Most of the first few kids that went away for life, because I was new and not very good as a defense attorney, were girls from Great Neck. A poor kid that May Newberger, the late May Newberger, was trying to save desperately because he was, to be popular, was selling acid in the park in Great Neck. But if you looked at him, you realized he's going to get eaten alive in prison. The two girls who came from Sands Point were runaways at 17. They went into the Minnesota Strip with Father, Bruce Ritter and all that. They became heavily addicted. They got life sentences. I have their picture back in my office, they sent me from Bedford Hills. And when they came out, nobody did life, by the way. After about 3 or 4 years, you got out. They got rid of their drug habit and became raving alcoholics. Jeff and I know full well that we had very affluent kids in Douglaston. One was stabbed to death at 12 o'clock in the afternoon in front of the Fresh Meadows Theater off of the Long Island Expressway, a lovely place. Stealing pot, he got stabbed. We had a lot of these examples. The point is that they were all very affluent kids. I have this other population that I work with. I've been mentoring children like the age of Jeff's kids, I work with 8, 9, and 10-year-olds every Wednesday for the past 20 years. Most of them are from El Salvador. I love them to death. Their world is so different than my friends from the North Shore. It's like two planets. Right now you may have seen a protest at the front of Hempstead High School that they still don't have their Chromebooks, for studying. We bought them all Kindle Fires. They don't know how to use them. Their world is very, very, very different. The street experience in the drugs, as we know from FCA's, Alexis Jinx and also our friends from the Harm Reduction Coalition. So it's a very, very different approach to working with the kids. I'll use the North Shore as an example of an affluent area versus our kids in Westbury, Freeport, Hempstead, Wyandanch, and little wonder that we have people marching in large numbers. One One, because I don't know about you, but I'm a kid from the 60s. I loved marching. I met terrific girls doing that. I mean, it was just great. And I felt like I was important and I was doing something, and everybody around me was affirming it. I had a purpose. I was going to burn the place down, but I had a purpose. So anyway, I'm not at all surprised that as pent-up rage and alienation is coming out of that. Whether the rules and regulations that folks are fighting for will be useful, that remains to be seen. We'll see. But yeah, so of course, on the positive side, I do think this technology actually is a very good tool. It is providing a little bit of that support, getting out to see your friends, even if they are electronic. And I appreciate that. And I think also Anthony's topic is particularly important because a large part of Long Island isn't that badly off, and yet they're in trouble. So anyway, this is great. And we'll be talking about that tomorrow at our Heroin Task Force meeting.
I would like to say that I think there should be more conversations such as the one Anthony had about the importance of social connection, that we are hardwired to be connected to people, to see people. And, you know, it's, I think, been very easy to say, well, you know, it's an addiction, but it's not, you know, it's physical. It's physical. I had no control over it. Whereas we really underestimated or maybe put to the side just the impact of being physically distanced, socially distanced, not just during this COVID, but for the last couple of years. And what are the results? You know, we're seeing teenagers with, you know, anxiety levels such that maybe none of us can relate to when we were going, you know, through high school, and the fear. But I'm glad that Anthony has brought that up, because it's important to talk about how we need to be socially connected. We need to be communities that reach out and get involved with one another. It's imperative.
You know, I think there's also, you know, the back to basics kind of stuff that's happening around COVID, I think is very, very positive. When we look at the number of kids who have ADD or ADHD, the numbers continue to increase. And I think part of that has to do with the way in which they consume media. And so if you think about TikTok, for example, and rapid fire 20-second videos, hours upon hours on end, kids watch these videos again and again and again. They wake up to them, they go to sleep to them, and then we wonder why kids can't focus. Well, because they're watching things in 20-second clips. They're taking little snippets of things, and you know, they've got their faces buried in their phones. And so when I see families going back to doing jigsaw puzzles and things like that, I think there's a benefit to all of that. I think there's something to be said for a family getting around the dinner table and having a conversation. I'm always, though, a little bit cautious, because you don't want to suggest that the sole antidote to addiction or to mental illness is just having dinner together. Just have dinner together and all be fine, right? We know that's not the case, but we know that there are a bunch of contributors to mental illness and to substance use disorders. And if you want to prevent those things from happening or hold them at bay, then there's a whole bunch of things that need to happen. And, you know, to Renee's point, and Renee is always very articulate about this, the reality is that we've fashioned a heavily criminal justice focused response to substance use disorders in a way that maybe at the end of the day isn't all that helpful. Are there folks who belong in the criminal justice system? Absolutely, with a shadow of a doubt. And sometimes that provides some leverage to get folks to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. But seeing it solely as a criminal justice problem because of some of the behaviors that folks engage in, I think is really a mistake. And one of the, I think, great advances over the past few years has been an understanding that there are multiple paths to recovery. Same goes for folks that have mental health issues, but for addiction especially, there's multiple paths. And for some people, that means medication. For other people, it means yoga and a different type of response. For most people, it involves a little bit of everything. And so I think one of the takeaways here tonight really is we have a number of tools available at our disposal. If you're not a yoga type person, go out and run. If you're not a running type of person, get a new puppy, as Ellen will attest to. And most importantly, make sure you're connecting with your own kids and the people in your own community. This is a time when we're all hiding behind masks and hiding behind plexiglass, and that's all important. But look for new and innovative ways to connect with folks on a deeper level. it's beneficial to us as human beings, but also it's also beneficial to the other person long after COVID is gone.
Something I'm very concerned about, partly because my grandson is involved with it, but also just thinking about it. My son and daughter-in-law and grandson live in DC metropolitan area in Maryland. And that whole area, Maryland, DC, Virginia, all the schools are closed. They're all working virtually. And I'm very worried about kids like my grandson who's in kindergarten, who is not getting any socialization, as are neither of his classmates are either, because they're seeing each other through on the screen, and that's it. And you talk about isolation. These kids are totally isolated. Kindergarten is the time when children should be socializing and learning to argue with each other correctly, learning to like each other correctly, play together, parallel play, going into playing together, and they're not getting that. And I'm wondering what's going to happen in the next 15 years as these kids in the Maryland, DC, Virginia area grow up, when they've had no socialization at all since preschool. His school ended, I think, March 13th. So there's been very little interaction. Yeah, there are some kids on his block that they see once in a while, but not like school should be. Yeah. And what's going to happen once they're in middle school and high school? Is there going to be a kickback as a result of that? Scares me.
It's a good point, David. I mean, I think we've talked a lot tonight about the adverse childhood experiences and kind of what shapes human behavior. But on the flip side of that, I mean, how do we define resilience, right? And how do we build resilience in our youth? Because the reality is there will be adverse experiences. You know, Anthony obviously mentioned a few. Parental separation and divorce is also an adverse childhood experience. And I mean, look around, 50, 60% of parents in this country end up dissolving their marriage. And so, you know, we know that when a youth is 5, 6, 7, we know that when they're children. And so I think the question is also, how do we build that resilience so that they can encounter difficult situations and move through them effectively?
If I can just relate an observation. This is from a long time ago. Years ago, many moons ago, I was the building psychologist at Floral Park High School. And, you know, that's a bedroom community, very nice place. But within my high school, which was grades 7 through 12, I also had the emotionally disturbed program in the building, which I had to monitor and handle. And it was at times terrifying because we had some very out of control, very angry, drug involved, broken kids in the program. And I came to realize, you know, just the level of family dysfunction that was going on in Floral Park, you know, domestic violence and alcoholism and just the sheer anger, And I'd see kids that would circle the drain, you know, and not make it. And then there were kids that did, and they seemed to be in the same circumstances, but why? You know, I was wondering about them. Why were they finding their way through? And what I came to realize was that if there was a person, an adult in their life that they could hang on to, maybe it was grandma, maybe it was grandpa, but somebody who was constantly a constant, a loving constant in their life, they could hang on and get through. And I get so concerned about how we are being so remote and faces in our phones, and you know, kids not getting that connection that they need. But I will never forget, honestly, you know, being in that high school and seeing the real difference between the kids that had somebody and the kids who didn't.
It's oh, go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, yes, I grew up in Douglaston as Renee did, and you know, it was a pretty liberal setting, and a lot of things were okay. That I also started out early on with my family in Levittown, so I knew the other end. And there's a disconnect. You know, when you're taking schools out of the situation here, there's no structure for kids. What are they going to rely on? All right, for me, it was sports in school. It was Boy Scouts, whatever it was that kept us going. After school activities, you don't have that right now, or very little of it. So when you go into a neighborhood that doesn't have any of these things, where do these kids go? I mean, there's a real disconnect. The schools or the battlegrounds, that's where you win their minds, all right? And that's where you save lives, put them on a path in a good direction. It's alarming to me that, as Jeff said earlier, that a lot of the emphasis is not being placed on helping people who may be suffering with mental illness or substance abuse co-issues there. And it's something that when I hear, well, funds for mental illness may not be as available, there's going to be a cutback perhaps. That's scary. If anything, we should be pouring money and talking about this every day, going into the communities, into the schools. And that's why our discussion last time on Project Help Long Island, we had clergy leaders on Long Island, you know, talking about what they're doing with their membership. And you know something, we have to have the religious institutions on the front lines. We have to have other groups on the front lines. We have to go into these neighborhoods and really help folks, because there's very little structure now. They need to reconnect. I need to touch and feel something before I buy. I can't just buy something online. I have to go out, you know. And early on, for me to have this structure, I would do walks every day, sometimes twice, 3 times a day with my wife. Walk by the liquor store, lines wrapped around the corner. You know, it's amazing. People, when they were driving, very erratic, very, you know, it can be crazy out there acting out. So you're seeing this, and we need our leaders from local on up to really hammer this through, because suicide is up. You know, the fatal and non-fatal overdoses are way up, over 30%, if I'm right, Renee. You know the statistics. We hear them all the time, and it's scary when you don't have something in place. What are they going to resort to? Well, they have all this free time. They're not going to listen to anybody because no one's out there telling them different. So if anybody hears that, well, you have a problem, they're not going to go because they may have a problem. You have to have it recorded on shows like this. Maybe you can attract people. Maybe you can start a group within these communities. And that's what they need. These kids will respond to us. I mean, I can remember I cooked culinary class to behaviorally challenged students in South Ozone Park. And these kids were handpicked for obvious reasons, all right? But you could see, after talking with them, getting to know them, how difficult it was for them just to put on your clothes each day and get out there. You know, I had a student call me up because, well, I can't make it to class today, Jeff, I'm incarcerated. You know, so this happens all the time in certain communities, and that's where you've got to concentrate your funds and groups and just go in there like it's a war, you know, and that's it. We're destroying our youth. And as David was saying, we're going to lose a generation here because of this virus if we don't jump in there. So that's my spiel.
Also, Jeff, we can share that in 2 weeks, we've got another program, yes, October 14th, and where we will be discussing similar topic as we are tonight, but we are including students on the panel, and to hear what it is they have to say and what they're experiencing and what their ideas are. And the students that are coming on are students that are very active within their schools, active in the community. They are young leaders in development, And it should be a very interesting evening to hear what it is they have to say, because we're speaking about them, but what is it they have to say, especially during this time?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, I know Connie, Bruno, and Jennifer DeSena, you know, will be bringing in professionals from the Manhasset school system, as we will for the Port Washington school system. And also I want to get some members of the Key Club and Circle K clubs involved of Kiwanis, all right? And that's also how you can get kids to participate in something or bring them into the circle, you know? So, you know, we're doing what we can, Project Help, Kathy. You know, it's been great, you know, and it's not going to stop. I'm not going to stop even when it's better, because you got to keep going. All right. So anyway.
Jeff, just a suggestion: when you get those young people and have the conversation, you know, there's a lot of listening that obviously should happen as part of that session, but they also become our very best ambassadors in reaching out to young people. And so young people respond to other people, other young people, in a way that they don't to folks that look, act, and talk like all of us. And so, and you know, honestly, it's not necessarily the kids in the Key Club that I worry about, although we worry about them too, just in a different kind of way. But their ability to reach back out to their peers to fill some of these gaps is really, really important. By kids not being in school, there's certain things that they're missing. They're missing the contact with school counselors and teachers who actually have eyes on them on a daily basis. As much as I question the utility of some of the large assemblies that schools do around substance use prevention and other issues, it's something, and for a lot of kids, it provides a way of saying, hey, I could use some help in a quiet way when a speaker is done. And so kids are missing out on a whole bunch of potentially supportive outreaches, and absent our ability to fix that immediately, these young people become the best ambassadors and the best lifesavers and lifeguards for other young people who might be struggling. And so empowering them to do that, giving them, helping them understand their responsibility in doing that, giving them the tools necessary to do that and the strength to go forward. And sometimes just the concrete talking points. Young people say, tell me exactly what to say, because they're not sure. So I hope that session includes some discussion around their ability to reach out to other people and to get kids in a way that we can't right now.
Yeah, maybe Jennifer or Connie could unmute themselves and talk about this anytime, ladies. If you're still there, I know I can see your names.
I couldn't agree more.
Jump in,
like calling them out.
I can text them.
Here comes Connie.
There she is.
Yep.
Hi, Connie.
How are you? Great presentation, all of you. Jen and I were just texting about some of the students that you may have for the next one, and perhaps we have some of the SALT members that we could offer up.
Agreed. And
I'd like to jump in also about something else. When I was on the school board of our local school, one of the things that we did, or the teachers did, teachers make a, staff, doesn't even always have to be teachers, in schools make a huge influence. And what they did was they took every student in each school, there was 3 schools, and they went around with all the teachers and they said, you know, and took the list of children and said, who relates to this child? Who relates to that child? And so that every child had somebody who they felt had a relationship with a staff or teacher. And when you have that personal relationship, and if they found a child with nobody saying they had a relationship, then they made an effort to make sure that that child, so when you touch a life in that way, and you say, you know, and make that, not make, but that child feels important because they do have a relationship. And that really does save a life as well. And we can all do things like that in our own lives. And again, I just want to repeat, families are the most important influence, even though these other people are really important and the whole situation is very complex. But just like when they had 9/11, they did a study, and that when families were together watching the TV and the, you know, the World Trade Centers coming down, families who said that was really awful, but didn't completely react in a way that was traumatic. The children did far better than the families who, or the parents who really were particularly upset and excited. I'm not the ones that lost people. We're just talking about other families. And so families lead the way, whether they're alarmists or whether they take life and they figure out, and that's resilience, as Nicole had said. How do you maneuver through stress and problems? And I always say to my family, my parents in particular, you model. What you model is one of the greatest influences in your children's life. Don't think they're not listening and they're not looking. They are. Even if they're 3 rooms away, they hear everything you're saying.
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up.
You were, Ellen, but there's something that we have to consider. There are also too many kids, unfortunately, who don't have intact families, who don't have families that they can rely upon. And so what do we do about those kids? You know, so that's where the teacher is very important, or the connect. You talked about connection in your district, or someone that you could connect with. In that case, that extra person is so important. It's just they don't have the support of the family.
Jeff, you were talking about engaging kids. I just wanted to make a quick point. Whenever I work with the 19-year-olds, I love them. But the first thing I want to do is recruit them. And so when we get to the topic of drugs, I'll begin with, so we're going to talk about drugs. And they'll look down the road, oh, not me, oh, God, no. And when I turn around saying, yeah, but does anybody have any friends involved with it? Oh, yeah. And then all of a sudden, boom, this huge river of stories. Oh, I've got a friend who's done this, and I've got a friend who's done that. And now we're talking. And what I'll often tell to them, because when I was a freshman in college, I was miserable. I was in a great school, and people seemed to be a lot smarter than me. And it was bad, and I used to feel poor. And I remember tell the kids, a lot of the adults are going to say to you, these are the best days of your life. And I used to say, well, then shoot me now, because I don't want to see the rest of my life. I said, if you're like in a funk and you're general in this big fog of malaise and depression, that's okay. It gets better. It really does get better. And not to, because they are down and they are worried about their futures, and especially now. But the other thing I say that, you know what? You're a college student. People, believe it or not, as weird as it is, respect you. You're a credible messenger. You're somebody who's got a friend out there, a younger brother who's in trouble. You can pass on the message that I cannot. And so you're important. You're very important. Now all of a sudden we got them listening. All of a sudden you've got a little ally out there. So that was really the basic message of when, both Jeffs, you're involved in recruiting the kids. And if you can pass that on to them, that actually they have value, they have merit, they have something to offer, and they've got people that we don't even know about, who they know about, are in big trouble. And so that was what I do. And I always make sure that every time I teach a class, it's a major thing. And I'm inviting them to attend these kind of events and maybe just be a fly on the wall, but see how the adults are doing. It's scary, but that's where your fate is. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say.
I want to thank Nicole Sullivan of Adelphi and Anthony Zankis for setting this up with Adelphi, because Project Help Long Island, we spoke at LIU Post last year, all right? And we brought a team there, and the kids loved it. This was Circle K, divisional.
Jeff, could you explain what that is?
Okay, Circle K is the Kiwanis level of students, college students. All right, and what we discussed is what we're discussing right now: addiction, opioid, fentanyl, vaping, things like that, mental illness and wellness, and it went over very well. And since then, spoken at Albany at their statewide convention, and Binghamton and Syracuse, and we were going to hit the Long Island universities where Circle K has a presence, Hofstra being in the other one. Nicole. And Nicole, by the way, was a recipient of a Kiwanis scholarship, I might say, right? And also Stony Brook and LIU Post. And we could use the Circle K and get these kids to go out and, and help others, be ambassadors of good health and wellness and healthy coping skills. So that was on our plan, but a peek into what we want to do, Project Help Long Island, with October with the students. November, seniors, big problem there, all right? And in December, Kath, I will talk to you and Pat about this. Ellen had a great idea. Maybe people in recovery, all right, that have stories of hope and promise to go into a new year, something to look forward to. And it can be an enjoyable, joyful time of the year, but it could also be very, very depressing.
Brutal.
So the thing is that we want to hit every facet we can, and we're going to keep doing this. So
I just wanted to add this. Kiwanis, and you folks know that Jeff and I are very involved in Kiwanis, and we're past lieutenant governors. Kiwanis is a service organization. It's international. It's in 88 countries, and we're seeing two things happen. One is a negative, but one is a very curious positive. The negative is that we're seeing numbers of members for adults dropping. It's becoming harder and harder to hold on to our community memberships. People are less inclined to join and participate. On the other hand, the fastest growing group of Kiwanians are Circle K, which is the college level, as Jeff said. It outnumbers the adults by like 4 or 5 to 1. I find that inspiring, that young people are looking for ways to be connected to help their community. And they're involved in a level that is just so impressive. They're involved with true problems, environmental problems, water, clean water, sick children in different parts of the world, but also within their communities. And, I tend to be an optimist. I look for things that make me feel optimistic. These kids make me feel optimistic that, we've got a shot here. When I see, young adults like this wanting to help the world.
I think that's fantastic and so important. We talk about how to build resilience in community. I'm just going to show a real quick screen share of something called developmental assets. So there's a group called the Search Institute, and you can look them up. They've got 40 developmental assets that they identified that are likely to be associated with success in different age groups. So they do it for early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and beyond. And the important thing was you only needed 10 of these to have what they considered success. More likely to go on to college or get a trade, less likely to be have teenage pregnancy, less likely to have run-ins with the law, more likely to have productive relationships, and on and on. And you notice that if you look at family support may not be there, but you could be okay if you had at least some sort of mentoring relationship, like what Renee is doing. By the way, a fantastic work, Renee, and it's just incredible that you do this. That matters in that young person's life, having a caring neighborhood and a caring school climate, and actually things like opportunities for creative activities and youth programs and things like that. So I loved what Kathy was saying about Circle K, because we realized that, look, I worked very closely with Child Protective in Nassau County and in Suffolk counties. They do a phenomenal job. It's not an easy job. We can't, we're not going to get to every home. It's just realistically not going to happen. But can we do other things to offset that? That doesn't mean we don't try to do what we can to eradicate child abuse, but we also need these other things. There's an interesting book that came out a few years ago called Bowling Alone by a guy named Robert Putnam. And he was kind of lamenting the loss of that club, that group thing that happened in communities a lot. Like, I remember my dad being part of a bowling league. Now, he wasn't also in Kiwanis, he was in Rotary. But 2 nights a week, he went out to his bowling league and he went out to Rotary, and both my parents sang in the church choir. So that was the 3rd night. And they were involved in their community. And I can't begin to think, there's never one reason, but there's so many things going on for adults and families being stressed out. But, listen, people have their phones and they're getting emails from their bosses at 10:30 at night. People literally fought and died for an 8-hour workday. Okay? We have to look at what world we're creating. I'm hoping that we might be able to, moving forward through and out of COVID, have some discussion about reconnecting with people, what's important, and how we can create communities that give people opportunities to connect in meaningful ways when it doesn't have to do with wealth and making money only, you know, just throwing it out there.
Exactly.
Can I just throw out a plug on, we're having a Where Do We Find Faith and Hope? Addressing the Challenges of COVID, Racism, and Loss, October 21st. We're going to have Dr. Penny Stern, which many of you may know, who does unconscious bias. And it is so impactful. And her first important part of it is raising awareness and what we all think and how we see things and our assumptions and judgments. So October 21st, go to NAMI website, and it'd be interesting. So it certainly gave me pause for thinking.
Well, do we have anyone else like to add to tonight's discussion?
I would just like to thank you for inviting me. This is a very informative evening for me, and I'm glad I attended. It was really helpful to me and things that I could bring back and share with others. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, and I want to thank everyone for taking their time to share their experience and everything else they had to add to tonight's discussion. I mean, it's invaluable. This is wonderful. Kathy and I are very, very grateful, as is Pat. And, you know, people ask me, I mean, Kathy used to say, I used to talk about doing something like Project Help for a couple of years before Kathy says, well, why don't you just do it? So I did it. And one thing led to another. And before you know it, I'm on this heroin task force. They said, are you kidding me? I actually sat in the wrong room, Renee. It was a supervisor. Talking about property taxes. And I said, I don't think I'm in the right room.
Yeah, just bozos on this bus. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but in any case, I got involved because every time I opened up the paper, there was an article about overdosing, addiction, fentanyl, vaping, you name it. And then on TV, same thing. On Facebook, same thing. It was hitting me every day. There was a discussion about it, an article written, and I said, you know something, I've got to do something. I have the ability and the stamina to do this, and some connections. So and
the passion, right?
Well, you have to. You know, I've got my own story, and but the thing is that I had to do something. Otherwise, you know, doing nothing is not an option. You know. So that's why I got involved, and Kathy and I are partners in crime, and we do a lot of this together.
Well, to any extent that I can give any value or service to you, we can certainly talk offline.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Takes a village.
Takes a village.
It really does. You know, all oars in the water, and we'll get there wherever we're supposed to be. And, you know, teamwork for sure. Anybody else at this time? Nicole, I sent you a flyer. Is that possible you could put that up and screen share? Or is that something I can do that myself?
1 second.
Let's see here. Yeah.
Okay.
That's tonight's flyer that I put together with my my beginner skills, and I'm getting better at Zoom. I'm getting better at PowerPoint and Word. So this is what we have, and I'll make another one like this. And by the way, Connie Bruno was the one that made this flyer originally, and I kept using a template. So thank you, Connie, on that.
Thanks, Jeff.
That's great.
Yeah. You know, I gotta get some kids in my sphere here to help me out with the tech skills. But yeah, if anybody would like to reach out to any one of our, if anybody wants to reach out to any one of our speakers, all you have to do is just email Kathy and myself at at projecthelplongisland@gmail. That's projecthelplongisland@gmail.com. All right. So, but there we have it. And again, thank you all so much. Be safe out there. The virus is still out there, so be very careful. And I'll see everybody soon enough. Renee, we got a task force meeting tomorrow, I believe.
Thank you.
Good. And we're going to see Nicole and Connie as we
Yes.
try to plan the next series. One of the reasons I'm here was to see how people are working on their different platforms. I know Jeff has some really good events coming up, 3 in a row through FCA. I know your series has been good. My goal is to, I peaked out about 10 years ago, so I've been on a descending curve of incompetence. So I don't expect to get better, I guess, just to prevent, the deterioration. But anyway, we're trying. And I know that Nicole, I think we're going to do some stuff with the Delphi. I'm excited about that. And I'm impressed with this format. The biggest question I have is that many of the projects we do give credit, and credit has to go for a full hour. But I'm wondering, Nicole, if we do this kind of thing, which I find much more interesting than listening to somebody, certainly not me, for an hour to do this, can you still wind up getting mental health credits and education credits because it was presented not by one amazing shining light, but by a whole group of stars?
You can, and we'll talk offline about kind of the criteria for that. One of the main pieces being an evaluation. So for New York State auditing purposes, in order to give CE credits, folks have to kind of complete an evaluation as a workshop. And the way that we've been doing that is all electronic through SurveyMonkey. So it's a link, they get it in their email, they answer a couple questions, and give them a deadline, and then we go ahead and send out the CE credits.
And the workshop could be a panel.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Is that, yeah, and every one of the panelists has to give you their resume, their bio. Oh my God.
It's what I do.
Okay.
We'll
All right.
talk.
God put you on the planet for a reason. Great. All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, I guess if there's nothing else, we'll say goodnight and see you all soon enough. Nicole, again, thank you so much. And Anthony for presenting and everyone here tonight.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you,
Good
everyone.
night. Take care. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.